Today, I'm gonna beat Clever at his own game and make mead before him. Stay tuned. Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. That is, except mead. We haven't learned how to do mead until now. It's definitely been one of the most requested projects, and we've tried several times in the past, but mead can be something, I guess, a little bit fragile to make, and a lot of times we just ended up growing mold. Or at least, Clever grew mold. Now it's my turn. But I had a secret weapon. Say hello to resident mead expert and friend of the channel, Ceri. I mean, no one ever said I couldn't have help. So, on one of the rare occasions that Kit's on vacation and I was house-sitting his house, I asked Ceri to come over and help me make mead. And it was apple season, and Kit lives in Massachusetts, so we decided to go apple picking and peach picking. Because we are gonna make 4 different types of mead. Because I'm an overachiever, I guess. At least I can be when there's someone holding my hand. We're gonna go with some recipes that Ceri's made before because she knows that they'll turn out good. Which also means that since they are things that she's made over and over again, the measurements might be a little vague, because at this point they're just muscle memory. But you get the idea, and there's lots of recipes for different types of mead on the internet. This is mine. You can't have secret recipe, but you can watch. So we're gonna do, like I said, 4 types of mead. We're gonna do a traditional mead to prove that we can. We're gonna do a boucher, I believe it's pronounced. I could be very wrong. It is French, and sometimes French words, they get you. Their letters are like assassins in the night. You never know when you actually use them or not. Sorry, that was just like a couple of years of French class in high school. Trauma rearing its head. It defeated me, French. So the boucher, however it's pronounced, is basically just caramelized honey. You caramelize the honey first before you use it in the mead. Our other 2 flavors, we're gonna try some fruit flavors. We're gonna have an apple pie mead, which is basically molasses, apples, and cinnamon. And then we're gonna have a vanilla peach, which is vanilla extract and peaches. Man, those peaches were so good. If you've never had freshly picked peaches, they're life-changing. You can't go back. Peaches just aren't the same after. Now that we know kind of what we're going for and we have our flavoring ingredients, let's prep what we need to actually make the mead. So going back to when I mentioned that Clever had brewed mold a bunch of times, that's probably one of the major threats of brewing anything, is bacteria gets into the mead or whatever while it's brewing, and then grows in there. You want to keep it sterile and closed off from the environment so that it can ferment in peace, the little yeasties are happy. To avoid any sort of contamination from getting into the mead while we're making it, we washed everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Not jokingly, I was told to prepare for making mead like I was going into surgery. Imagine the container you're going to be making mead is an open body and you cannot let any bacteria in lest it get contaminated. We're doing fermentation surgery. That's not a pleasant thought. Don't think about that, actually. Erase that part. After cleaning everything, we took the time to prepare all of our ingredients so that it would be easier to mix the mead together later. First, we prepared the fruit. So to try and help the fruit ferment as best as possible, we cut up the apples into slices, making sure to cut out any part that might have apple seeds in them, because they are a wee bit poisonous and we don't want them in our mead. Don't poison your friends, unless you mean to. I also took the time, technically before I cut them up, to wash all of the apples with warm, soapy water. And this is not just because of the whole prepare like you're going into surgery thing. It's because a lot of apples actually have wax on the skins. Even the freshly picked ones, because they spray wax onto them to try and prevent insects from getting to them. Ones you may get in the grocery store may have much more wax on them, because they also wax them to make them look pretty and shiny. It's not dangerous to us to eat, but we don't want it in our mead. We'll talk about impurities later. For the peaches, we want to do something similar where we want to wash it in warm soapy water, but this time to remove the fuzz on it. We don't want the fuzz in the mead. This is a no fuzz zone. It's the fuzz! I just felt like I went back to Prohibition era right there. Quick, get rid of the fuzz! They'll know we're brewing down here! Dork. From there, it's pretty simple to just split the peaches in 2, take out the pits. We also took the time to prepare our yeast. We're using this sparkling wine yeast, which I'll try to collect all of the ingredients and stuff that we used and put them in the description, except that, the apples we picked from trees, but, find one, I don't know. So you can use normal baking yeast, but I would recommend getting actual brewer's yeast, because if you're gonna spend this long making something, you don't want to get to the end and then find out it didn't quite work the way you wanted it to. So to prepare our yeast, all we did was get some warm water, not too hot. We don't want to kill our yeasty babies. We give a little bit of a dibble of honey so they can numb away and wake up. We pour our yeasty babies in and give it a stir. and we let them foam away in a corner. We'll get back to them later, once they're all awakened and ready. All right, now let's talk about our honey. So I briefly mentioned impurities before. You don't really want impurities in your mead. They can affect the flavor, the brewing process, and potentially give you a worse headache at the end when you drink it. But apparently there's two schools of thought when it comes to the honey you use. Some people like to use the kind of wild, unprocessed honey, and then some people use store-bought and processed honey. It's a thing of preference, but it does affect how you prepare your honey for the mead. Store-bought honey is processed for a reason. It gets rid of all the impurities in the honey that the bees leave behind. To purify the honey, typically you boil it and all the impurities will come to the surface and you scrape them off. You can also boil store-bought honey. There will still be minor amounts of impurities left over, but it's not necessary. We ended up going for store-bought, so we have raw unfiltered honey, which unfiltered doesn't necessarily mean unprocessed. It was processed. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we're going to be making a gallon of each type of mead, so all of our ingredients are kind of curated to that amount. For the honey, we're using 3 pounds per gallon. Now, we don't have to process our honey, but since we're making the boucher, which we're gonna caramelize the honey, we can show you basically the process. We're gonna bust out a pretty deep pan here. If anyone's ever done any sort of boiling with sugar, you know that it can be a little bit temperamental. You wanna give yourself space to react. You'll see. And then we just set up our pan on our handy little portable stove, because this is a basement operation. Skilltree doesn't see the light of day. We're gonna put a little bit of water at the bottom before we add the honey. This will keep the honey from sticking to the bottom of the pan, and also dilute it a tiny bit so it's easier to stir and the heat processes a little bit more evenly. From there, we're gonna heat the honey, making sure to stir it pretty consistently. And you know it's working when it starts to get foamy on the top and bubble. That foam is technically not really foam. That is actually the impurities coming out. That's leftover wax. You'll see there's not actually that much in our honey, but you can only imagine how much like wild honey has. Apparently it's a lot more. We just end up scooping the impurities into the cup of water. Like I said before, it's nowhere near anything that can do any harm to you, and it actually makes some pretty nice honeyed water. So this is what happens when your honey gets too hot. This is what I meant by sugar tends to be a little bit temperamental. It'll foam up hard. And if you don't pay attention, it very easily can come over the side of the pot and make a mess, and then you have a bad time. Just make sure to keep an eye on it because it happens very quickly, and just lower the temperature and make sure to keep stirring it. The stirring is very important no matter what heat because it keeps it from crystallizing and from sticking to the sides. So we're gonna cook the honey beyond what you would normally do to remove the impurities because we're trying to caramelize it. Think of it like browning sugar or butter. So we keep it at that medium heat until the color starts to darken and the scent of it starts to have kind of like a browned aspect to it. It's hard to describe, kind of like brown sugar. Apparently you can continue to caramelize it until it's like super dark. Depends on the flavor you want, I suppose. But eventually we had to stop, so we pulled it off the fire and let it cool down. All the extra impurities floated to the surface and we took the time to scoop it away, and we're left with our boucher. I hope that's how you say it, because the rhyme made me happy. Now that we have all our ingredients prepared, let's start to add them to the container. To start our mead base, before we add any flavoring, we're gonna copy the trick with the pan and pour a little bit of water into the bottom so the honey doesn't stick. Then we're gonna unceremoniously dump all 3 pounds of honey into the container. Now, since honey's very viscous, there will be a certain amount that won't come out. Ceri taught me a trick where basically you just cap it again and you leave it off to the side and it'll all collect at the bottom. And then you can just stir it in later. You want every drop of honey you can. That's where the goodness comes from. For the boucher, since the flavoring is in the honey itself, we're just using that for the base. And here you can see the difference in color. I'll be honest, while I was making it, I really didn't see the difference until they were put next to each other. But the boucher is definitely darker. Especially when we add more water and the honey starts to dilute, you really see the difference in the boucher there. So for the water that you use to make your mead base, you can use tap water. Unless your tap water's weird, know your tap water. You can also use fruit juices if you want to influence the flavors in different ways, but just know that it will make it more sugary by the end of it. Awesome, now that our mead has a solid base, it's time to add our flavorings. Except for the boucher, it's all mature and French in the corner. I'll conquer you one day, French. We'll start with the peach and vanilla. So for the gallon of mead that we're making, we're gonna pour about a tablespoon of vanilla extract into it. Then we add our halved peaches, which we had around 6 peaches. Then we're gonna give it a good stir, and we're gonna fill the rest of the space up with water. So now that we're on the flavorings, now that we're on the flavoring part, I highly recommend that you look into mead because it's kind of like wine. in the sense that depending on how you make it and what you put into it, they're considered different types of mead. So because we're putting peaches into this one's called a melomel, which is basically any mead that has fruit in it. But there's some subcategories for some of the more common fruit. So because the other one has apples in it, it's called a Kaiser, which is a melomel made with apples. Okay, when you're adding the water, there's something very important to keep in mind. I like how mead is relatively easy, but then there's some specific, very important things that you should not mess up. One of which is making sure that you leave headroom. Fermenting is basically yeast eating sugar and producing alcohol and gas as a result. Think of it like when you add yeast to bread. It makes a bunch of gases, which is why the dough gets so big. And it's all delicious and fluffy when you cook it. It's all those air bubbles in there. So the gases for mead a little bit less delicious and fluffy and a little bit more explodey. If you don't leave enough space at the top to allow for those fluctuations of gases, one day you will just hear a crash and then there will be a mead geyser, which is basically the pressure got too much, it popped the top and exploded. Don't do that. If you're new to it, you can't hurt the mead by adding too much headroom. Too little, it might explode. Too much, and you just have a little bit less mead at the end. And you can always add more water later. From here, all you really have to do is add your yeast, which have thrived in our wonderful little honey cups. So we pour it into our flavored mead. Then we just stir it to make sure everything's all mixed well together. And that's our peach and vanilla. From there, we repeat the process with the different flavors. For the apple one, we add the apples. We eyeball a healthy glop of molasses, and then we add 2 cinnamon sticks. Then I struggled to mix it all together because apples are a lot more dense than peaches. I think we added around 4 to 5 cut up apples, by the way, maybe 4. They were really big, they were Honeycrisp apples. Then we filled the extra space with water, making sure to leave headroom, and poured in our yeast. And then I struggled to stir again. For the boucher and the traditional mead, since they don't have any extra flavors to add, we're gonna add the yeast, and then just fill up the extra space with water. From here, the last step is to seal the top. You want to make sure that the air seal is put on correctly. For these, it's a rubber ring around the outside, which we also washed. And then we have the, I don't actually know what this is called. It's like an air release device. Basically, it's going to let the air bubble out of the mead, preventing mead explosions, but it's going to keep anything from getting into the mead. It does this by having these 2 parts where the air will bubble over the tube on one side, which we will fill with water, and then it will go out the gaps in the other side. So basically it's going up, then down, and then up again, and it has to go through water the whole time to get out, which gas can do, but a lot of bacteria or insects or anything can't, unless it's just like a very determined fruit fly. And from there, our mead is pretty much done. The only thing left to do now is to care for it and then bottle it at the end. And with that, I have successfully prepared mead. I haven't made it yet. That takes a while. So mead takes a few months to ferment, and you're gonna wanna stir it while it ferments, making sure that basically it doesn't get stagnant, because that's when mold might potentially grow, especially for the fruit ones, because they're floating at the top, so mold can grow on the bits that are open air much easier than the ones that are under the water. But as your mead ferments, the yeast inside get bigger and stronger and more likely to kill off any sort of bacteria in there. Also, the alcohol level rises, and that's not a bacteria-friendly environment. Whenever you go to stir it, also make sure that the water inside of the airlocks is clean and to the appropriate level. We actually had a very determined fruit fly at least get to the water, not necessarily through all the complicated loops. So it did its job. But the water will evaporate over time, so make sure to just refresh your airlocks whenever it seems like they need it. The first month of fermenting is probably the most fragile. So for the first 2 weeks, you want to stir every single day. And as you get through the second week, you can start to move it to every other day. Once you get past the first month, you can start to stir it maybe twice a week. Unless it's a fruit one that's still floating at the top, then you want to stir it a little bit more consistently. So speaking of months, we were planning to give these meads 1 month to go through their initial fermentation. From there, there's 2 options. You can either leave it like that until it's done fermenting. You can tell when mead is done fermenting because it'll stop having little bubbles in it, and it'll get very clear, kind of almost as clear as my tea. For the fruit ones, you want to make sure that the fruit has sunk to the bottom. Once it sinks below the surface, you don't have to stir it as consistently. You can treat it like other mead, but you want it to sink to the bottom because that tells you that all the sugars and flavor and stuff in the fruit have been processed by the yeast. If your fruit lasts longer than your yeast, then I don't know what to tell you. You have superfruit. I stirred it the rest of the week while I was house sitting, and then I taught Clever how to do it. And I hoped and prayed that I would come back to mead, not mold.
Quick note from Clever here. It's all well and good that Maddie went ahead and made some mead, but who do you think has to stir it for the next few months? This guy. Which is fine, because as a crafter, my hands are always busy. Whether it's carving or stitching or piecing something together, moving my hands is just part of who I am. But when there's nothing left to craft, that urge doesn't just go away. That's when I've been reaching for today's sponsor, Fume. Fume is a flavored air device. It's nicotine-free, vapor-free, and just perfect for fidgeting. It's got that same satisfying weight and feel in my hands that I look for in tools, but it's purpose-designed for those moments where you just kind of need something to fidget with. Not only that, but as a flavored air device, it has these little cores inside of them with a bunch of different flavors. Flavors like cinnamon hearts, spearmints, crisp mints. I really love the cinnamon hearts right now, by the way. And best of all, this bad boy doesn't need any batteries, so I'm always good to use it whenever. Anyways, with Black Friday and Cyber Monday around the corner, it's the perfect time to give this thing a try if you're interested. Just head to tryfume.com/skilltree and use my code SKILLTREE to buy one journey pack and get a second 70% off. You could also use the QR code if that's easier. Plus, there's a chance to win the limited edition gold-plated Fume. So not only do you get to fidget, but you get to fidget in style. So if you've got hands like mine that are always looking for something to do, why don't you give Fume a try? Just go to tryfume.com/skilltree and use code SKILLTREE. Okay, let's get back to stirring that mead.
Man, my little soldiers, my little yeast there, they're overachievers. So we put it off for another month. The bouquet started to look clear enough that we could potentially bottle it, but at that point I had waited long enough. It was a hard time for me. I really let myself go. I was too busy taking care of that mead, take care of myself, you know. Sometimes you give it all for your kids. We weren't quite sure the bouquet was done enough, but we called in Ceri anyway, because at this point we just wanted to get the video to you guys. And it did turn out that the bouquet was still going. So we decided to just go through the motions and film what we would be doing once it was done. As you can see, our peaches have dropped, but those apples, man, they have not budged the slightest bit. They live up there. But you can see the collection of dead yeast at the bottom, which shows that the processes are happening in there. To test exactly how much of those processes have been going on, we're gonna test the alcohol content. So to measure the alcohol content, we're gonna pull out this Brix reader. Brix readers measure sugar content, so it's gonna measure the alcohol content using buoyancy. Basically, it's weighted so that depending on how much alcohol is in there, gives you a specific measurement of the percentage of alcohol by floating up to that measurement. It's actually really cool. So Ceri brought this magic tube thing. We used the magic tube thing to fill up the cylinder with the bouquet. Now that it's full, we're gonna put the Brix meter in it so it can tell us what the alcohol content is. We also took this as an opportunity to test the mead. And honestly, it's young, so it has a bit of a bitter note, but it's really good. I'm making mead, guys. So this is the point that if you don't like the flavor, if it's not sweet enough or you were going for something else, you can back flavor it or back sweeten it. Ceri says the best way to do this is to pour honey into a spoon and then just stir it into the mead. Then just taste it again until you get to where you want it to be. You can also take out any of the fruit that's dropped, filter it to get rid of dead yeast, pour it into a fresh container, and then fill it up with water again. But it's not necessary. And this is where we start to go through the motions of bottling it, because as we were tasting it, we saw the bubbles and we knew that yeast was still working. And we wanted to give it the best opportunity it can. This is my first mead. I'm not gonna take it out prematurely. But once it's done fermenting, typically you put it in bottles, and then you let it age in those bottles for the next few months. And that's where the flavor develops. You know, I didn't ask, but I wonder why you need to bottle it and you can't just leave it in a place that you can continuously taste it. Someone tell me in the comments why that is. You think there'd be a benefit to being able to taste it while it fermented? Maybe just because you want to use the equipment for other meads? Leave it in the comments below. Speaking of a true seal, we're gonna bottle these in basically wine bottles. And going back to the mead geyser, if the yeast is still alive and it's still fermenting, it will continuously make gas, which will build up in a bottle that doesn't have an airlock anymore. That's when it explodes. To make sure that doesn't happen, there are these things called sodium Camden tablets. They serve two roles. They're a disinfectant, they're food safe, and they won't affect the flavor, but they'll kill anything in there that can potentially affect your mead, including the yeast. This is a way to kill off the remaining yeast so you can bottle it without having to worry about pressure building up and exploding later. It will hard end any fermenting, so don't do it before you're ready to bottle though. So for each gallon, you want to put around 3 tablets in. So we would have put 3 tablets into our mead if it was done. Then you want to let it sit 30 minutes to an hour so that it settles and is completely clear. Once it's clear, we're ready to start bottling. So the gallon of mead that we made should fill around 3 to 4 bottles. Make sure you have enough bottles on hand. While the Camden tablets are doing their work, we're actually going to soak the corks of the bottles. Soaking them will make them a little bit more flexible, which will make it easier to cork once we get to that point. From here, you want to filter your mead, so any leftover fruit, the dead yeast, all of it. You want to take all of that out, so all you have left is a clear mead. Then all that's left to do is just pour it into a bottle. Once they're all in a bottle, you cork each one, which, by the way, Ceri said that if you're going to splurge for any nice equipment, splurge for a corker. Look at this beast of a beauty. Apparently that little dial thing that you see sticking down can be adjusted to adjust the depth of the cork when you push into the bottle, which makes sense. It looks like it moves up and down, and that's the part that pushes into the cork. But with a flex of muscles, Ceri has corked our totally real mead. And look at it! Look at the little mead! Ignore the not corked mead in the background. It's real mead, I swear. The last thing you should do is label your bottles. You probably want to put the date that they were bottled, the ingredients and the flavor and all that. Because if you have multiple flavors, all you have now is a bunch of bottles of vaguely tinted clear liquid. In fact, when I first met up with Ceri to start doing the mead, she gave me 2 bottles of mead she had made like years ago, so she had no idea what the flavors were anymore. Another thing that you can do is get one of those plastic wraps or wax seals that you can put on the top to protect the cork. Make sure it doesn't get soaked or aged or anything like that. And also, you know, it makes it pretty. But yeah, we made mead. I'm gonna claim it there, because at this point, it's about 12% alcohol content. It's young, but I could kill the yeast. I could murder the yeast and bottle them now. I made mead. I did it. Huzzah! After so many years of people asking us to make mead and clever trying, like 3 or 4 times, we finally had someone tell us what we were doing wrong enough that we did it. We made mead. Huzzah! I really want to thank Ceri for coming out and not only bringing just all of the equipment we needed to make mead, but all of the experience and help to get us to this point. It really was a blast to not only spend time with her, but making mead in general. And we can finally taste what they end up being. Maybe we'll be able to bring them to Conquest next year and drink them with you. Man, that would be cool. I do highly recommend anyone who is interested in this and can afford the starter equipment for it, give it a try, man. This and making perfume, nothing makes you feel more like an alchemist than these kinds of things. They are so fun. And you get mead at the end of it. Mead that you decide how it tastes. So cool. All right, well, this video has so far been over 2 months in the making, and who knows how many months will pass for them to finish, especially the apple one. Yeah, the fruit, they are not budging. But when we get to that point, we'll give you guys an update. In the meantime, keep leveling up, you. You made it to the end screen. That's a fantastic way to support our channel. Another way to support this channel is by joining these people's noble ranks. These are our Patreon members, and they pay to keep the lights on while we wait for the mead to finish. We can't emphasize enough how much the Patreon genuinely supports the running of their channel. Crafting things can get pretty expensive, but we love sharing these sorts of things with you, and it's the Patreon that makes that happen. A special shout out to our newest high-tier patron member, Wade Towner. And of course, a shout out to our Grand Master Council of Patreon members, WildFox99, Froggy, Dragon Design, and Yuri Sashiro. But yeah, the Patreon really is the bedrock of this channel. They're one of the entire reasons I can even fly up here to be able to do content for you. Plane tickets are not cheap. But with your help, I am also able to do different types of crafts and projects. And Kit's able to go on vacation. If you want to join our Patreon, the link is in the description below. Otherwise, you can watch one of these videos here, and YouTube likes that too. Honestly, one of the best ways that you can support us in a non-financial way is by continuing to watch the videos and sharing them with your friends. It tells YouTube that you like our stuff. Sometimes that YouTube algorithm is as delicate as mead making. You do one thing wrong, and suddenly you got a mead geyser.